And now let's invite on stage our next speaker, Dr. Bill Boothby, who has been working with Tallinn Manual, who's also engaged now in Tallinn Manual 2 processes, and he will be speaking to us about the main critiques that he has found in different published literature about the Tallinn Manual published in 2013. He has done extensive research, and we're very glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to come back to your marvelous city. I love it, and I love the people in it as well. And yes, we're now going from the macro down to the micro. So control your expectations. Imagine my joy when, in deepest, darkest November, the telephone rang. And at the other end of the phone was none other than Mike Schmidt. Bill, I need your help. Yes. It's to do with Tallinn 2. Yes. We need somebody not to work on Tallinn 2, because we know that's outside your area of interest, but we need somebody to go through the literature that's been published since Tallinn 1 and to work out what amendments are required to the text of Tallinn 1. And it's all right, don't worry, you've got plenty of time. We need your report in January, and this was in November. I paraphrase slightly for effect. What I'm going to try and brief you on is the process, the methodology, where it led, and my thoughts, because this is very much work in progress, in broadly the same way as what you've just heard in relation to Tallinn 2 constitutes work in progress as well. And I'll explain to you why it's work in progress in a moment. So, I'm going to talk about methodology. I'm going to give you one or two admittedly extremely generalized examples of the sort of amendments that I'm going to be proposing. So I'm deliberately sticking my neck on the chopping block, because you people are going to hear what I'm going to say. And if what I'm going to say doesn't subsequently appear in the amendments that actually appear in the manual, you'll realize that I lost my case. And I'm then going to talk about one or two things that I think constitute work that needs to be done at some point in the future. And you'll see as we go through what I mean by that. But the methodology first, as promised. It's correct, we all realize, that the Tallinn Manual first saw the light of day in April 2013. That is not very long ago. And yet, during the period in between, there has been a huge amount of interest shown in the text of that document. The manual states specifically the law as is. It doesn't set out to declare what is called lex ferenda, i.e. views as to how the law might usefully develop in the future. It would be crazy, it seems to me, at this stage, for us to seek to put together some sort of revised edition of the Tallinn Manual. And that absolutely explicitly is what I am not seeking to achieve. The manual, in its introductory paragraphs, makes it clear that what it seeks to do is to reflect all reasonable, I think reasonable is the right word that's used there, all reasonable positions on each of the statements or declarations of law contained within it. Remember that its text is divided into black letter rules i.e. the rules printed in bold script. And the great significance of those is that they are the text on which the experts that prepared the manual were agreed. They were achieved, if you like, by consensus. Contrast the associated commentaries, which are not expressed in bold script, and which fulfill a variety of purposes, from setting out the legal basis for the propositions put forward in the bold text, explaining points of difference between the various experts as they develop their view or discussion, and providing general clarification. This business of reflecting all reasonable positions was something that we tried to achieve in the body of those commentaries. We tried to ensure that the commentaries reflected competing views subject to this reasonableness criterion. So essentially what I was being asked to do was to go through the manual text, in particular the commentaries, and ask myself whether there was any manifest error that the subsequent literature had thrown up and which we could conveniently correct, and also to ask whether there was anything that we missed. And I did that. I was given some pretty precise ground rules within which to operate. There was no carte blanche here, okay? And I'll go through the ground rules with you because I think it's important that you understand the basis upon which I was working. Clearly, I had no authority to change black letter law. Why? Because black letter law was being adopted by the group of experts as a whole. And I'm only small, as you can see, and I certainly do not consist of the group of experts as a whole. Secondly, any amendments that should be made must continue to reflect lex lata. We are not, as a part of this process, suddenly going to start lurching off into declarations of lex ferenda. There was going to be no requirement or wish, indeed, for large-scale changes to the texts of the commentaries because, in large measure, those commentaries reflect the discussions that originally took place between the consulting experts. So, in the time between November and the January when I submitted my report, I had a marvelous Christmas reviewing 55 publications which varied in length from something like 15 pages to, I think one of them was 196 pages in length. And I maintained my aim, namely to reflect the perspectives that may not have been represented in the commentary and to work out whether I could detect any errors, and if so, to seek to correct them. What I have put forward to the Tallinn 2.0 process is my reflection, and it will remain to be seen whether my reflection is reflected in what emerges. The proposed amendments will, in due course, be considered by a core group who formed the drafting committee of Tallinn 1, and will then be considered by the group of experts in due course. Core point, absolutely critical. I think relatively few amendments are required. I think that the commentaries that you have in front of you in the Tallinn manual text do indeed achieve the objective of reflecting all reasonable views, subject to what are, let's be honest, some pretty minor tweaks. I think that going through the text reinforces the view that care was taken to exclude lex ferenda. And indeed, I would say that quite a significant element of the literature that's been published since the appearance of the Tallinn Manual does seem to me to be talking rather more lex ferenda than lex lata, although those authoring those documents don't always necessarily acknowledge that that is the case when doing so. Most of the amendments that I've put together constitute matters of pretty trivial detail. Nevertheless, detail or not, I have come to the conclusion, where appropriate, that minor amendments are called for. And then I'll give you one or two very generalized examples of what it is that I think we might be talking about. So, for instance, if you look at a piece of commentary, a sentence, where an assertion is made which appears to conflict with a corresponding assertion covering a similar topic elsewhere, perhaps in another commentary to another rule, then clearly one needs to address that inconsistency. Similarly, it seems appropriate, because a comment has been made, it seems appropriate to clarify what we're saying about the powers of regional organizations apropos action under Article 42 of the UN Charter. Remember, under Article 42 of the UN Charter, the requirement is for the authority to be given by the UN Security Council. Nobody, I think, that was involved in preparing the appropriate part of the commentary disputed that that was the case and that that authority was still required even in circumstances where it is a regional organization that will be taking the necessary action. I think that with a minor tweak to the wording, that clearly original intent could be made, shall we say, a little clearer. Minor amendments to the use of force factors. What do I mean by those? If you look at the commentary to the rule addressing the use of force, you will see that there are enumerated, if I remember correctly, 8 factors such as severity, measurability, and immediacy, and so on and so forth, which are, in my view, entirely correctly described in the commentary as being factors that states would appear likely to consider when determining whether a particular cyber event amounts to a use of force for the purposes of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Some people have commented in the literature on those factors, failing to hoist in the descriptor, which I have just gone through, and imagining that they are put forward as having legal status, as opposed to having status of factors that states appear likely to consider in the way I've described. But nevertheless, there would appear to be certain tweaks that we could make in the wording of one or two of those factors, and I have made appropriate proposals. A point was made in one area of the literature that from the point of view of direct participation in hostilities, it could be made usefully clear that the innocent, unwitting individual whose computer is commandeered, slaved, I think will be the expression, in order to be involved, if you like, in the conduct of a cyber operation, should not be regarded as directly participating in hostilities. Remember, if you will, that direct participation in hostilities is the activity that has the effect inter alia of depriving a citizen, a civilian, of protected status under targeting law. So what we're saying here is the mere fact that you have a computer which has been slaved by some cyber operator, some cyber hacker, in order to participate in their cyber operation, ought not to cause you to be regarded as directly participating and thereby to lose your protected status if you are an unwitting individual in that respect. We then talk about, or I then talk about cyber weapons. I must admit, I'm the one that wrote a certain tome on the subject of the law of weaponry, as some in this room will be aware. And I've been thinking a bit further about the definition of cyber weapon as reflected in the Tallinn manual. I'm a little worried that it talks in the definition, which isn't a piece of black letter law, but is set out in the commentary. It talks in terms of the capability to injure or damage. And I'm not sure at all that capability in that respect is actually the definitive criterion. I think that the definitive criterion is use of an object, intention to use an object, or design of an object. And I think that those are the three factors that need to be translated across into the cyber context in order to characterize a cyber tool as a cyber weapon. And I think that references to capability to injure or damage would be over-inclusive in terms of bringing within the ambit of a cyber weapon all sorts of objects or capabilities or malware or even pieces of cyber equipment where nobody would ever intend actually to use them as a weapon. I then looked at Rule 31, paragraph 5. There's a lot of discussion in the literature about the relationship between the notion of military operations and the notion of a cyber attack, or indeed an attack in general. And the view that I think I draw from what I've read is that to equate the notion of military operations as used in Article 48 and Article 57, paragraph 1 of Protocol 1 with the notion of attack is to fail adequately to take into account that different words are being used in those two notions, which immediately would suggest that they have differing meanings. And I think that we are narrowing down too much the notion of military operations when we reflect it as constituting essentially exclusively attacks. And therefore what I am proposing is a very minor tweak to the language in paragraph 5 of the commentary to that rule, with a view to loosening, if you like, that point. And then the final thought is that where social media networks are concerned, arguably you could say that the whole of a social media network might be turned into a military objective if that social media network is used in such a way as to satisfy the definition in Article 52, paragraph 2 of Protocol 1. I think possibly a better approach will be to talk in terms of a part of a social media service being used for military purposes as becoming a military objective, to the extent that a particular part of the social media network can be, if you like, realistically divided off in that sense. So if those are items that I think might be usefully thought about with a view to amendments to the text as part of the process that I was asked to undertake, clearly, as you go through this sort of process, this sort of review, inevitably you see discussion in the literature which causes you to wonder what sort of amendments we might like to think about for the longer term. And there has been extensive discussion, and I think it's still respectable to say that this is lex ferenda discussion rather than lex lata, about the definition of cyber attack, including major disruption. My worry is that saying to ourselves, right, well, okay, a cyber attack will include a cyber operation as a result of which critical national infrastructure is disrupted in a non-injurious, non-damaging way. It's fine to come to the conclusion that, okay, yes, that's going to constitute an attack in the abstract. But your problem when seeking to operationalize that sort of notion is that you've got to ask yourself, well, actually, how major is major for the point of view of major disruption? And I suppose also, how disruptive does disruption need to be in order to constitute disruption that's going to satisfy the criterion? And you've got a sort of series of shades of grey, haven't you? And inevitably, at some point, you're going to have to draw a dividing line which is going to satisfy nobody. But nevertheless, I think there's an issue there that we're going to have to grip at some point. And then I pose the question on the slide, does damage for the purposes of cyber attack presuppose a tangible object? What about data destruction? You see, in the Tallinn manual, the view is taken that functionality disruption, or destruction, if you like, of functionality, constitutes damage if physical repair is necessary. The open question is at what point one needs to include some sort of virtual repair. At what point does one need to say that it's not only physical damage that constitutes damage? That if one's talking about applying these notions in the cyber context, one actually has to be prepared, I suppose, to say that you're going to give a cyber meaning to the cyber notion in the cyber context. Otherwise, if you're only giving a physical meaning to a legal notion in the cyber context, arguably you're missing a trick. And I'm deeply conscious that there is broad consensus that that is the direction in which the law is going, and Mike Schmidt's Quo Vadis article certainly is a case in point in terms of arguing in that direction. Segregating civilian from military computer use. It's all very well to read Article 58 of Protocol 1, Precautions Against the Effects of Attacks. It's all very well to talk to international conferences about trying to segregate military objectives in the cyber domain from civilian networks. But are we getting to the point where that's no longer realistic? And if we are getting to the point where that's no longer realistic, so what? And the so what, I suppose, is that one ceases to bleat about what states can't realistically be expected to do, and that one then goes on to ask oneself, what are the implications of that for the obligation to take precautions? How far does that obligation to take those precautions go in a situation where this is the way in which, in practice, most states are structuring their infrastructure, both military and civilian? So, what have we got? We've got some points for now, and we've got some points for the future. How far away is the future? I don't know. This is an area, it seems to me, this cyber area, in which two things are progressing very rapidly in parallel. The first thing that's progressing is the technology itself. And I promise you, I'm not going to lead you into a Rumsfeldian world, but certainly I suspect there is a very considerable delta between the progress that we're aware of and the progress underneath the bedclothes, so to speak, of which we are not aware in the technical sense. And then the other thing that's moving on is our understanding of the legal implications of the technology. And it's those two factors, twin factors it seems to me, that must inform our appreciation of how the law must be brought to bear. And I haven't spoken about Russian perspectives, and I haven't spoken about Chinese perspectives, but at some stage, it seems to me, that Russian and Chinese perspectives must also be brought, as far as one can, within the fold. But that will be, perhaps, for another day. So, what are my conclusions? Number one, that the Tallinn Manual has been widely welcomed and that it has had a major impact. Probably an infinitely greater impact than the very few of us who gathered around a table here in Tallinn all those years ago and asked ourselves the question, are we going to do this? And answered yes, could ever have imagined. It does, in my view, the current text, largely reflect all respectable views, or even reasonable ones. Some minor tweaks will be required within the terms of the working rules, if you like, against which I was operating. And as I pointed out just now, as technology and understanding progress, certain issues are going to require further thought. Those are my thoughts. I said 55 publications. It's now 57. The work continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. You presented your options to have minor tweaks on the comments, but was there anything that you would have changed in the bold letter text? It would have been against the rules, but that would be my question.
It's a very good question. And what I'm debating about is whether I'm going to answer it or not. I think what I would say, the way I would approach my answer is this. One has to understand that the whole process of writing a manual is not about what I would say. It's not with respect about what you would say. It isn't even about what he would say. There may be occasions when he thinks it is, but no, seriously, it's about what the collective group of experts collectively are prepared to agree. And that's why I didn't actually advert my mind to the point you raised. Why? Because I'm not presuming to be able to get into the heads of the collective group of experts with a view to working out what I think they collectively would have thought. I was therefore quite content to limit myself in the way I was asked to do, to look at the commentary and just, I wasn't biting off more than I could chew. At least not in terms of the task. I certainly was in terms of the reading, but not in terms of the task. So I was content from that point of view. Anyone else?
Questions? Yes.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. Hi, Kubo Machag, University of Exeter. Were you concerned about situations when the experts stated that they didn't agree, but the agreement or the reasons for disagreement were not elucidated in the text? So, for example, in the law of self-defense, when the experts refer to situations when an attack is motivated by private interests, there is clearly elucidated both positions.
Yes.
But the reasons for that are not given in the manual. So would that be something that you would also highlight as a possible, modification for the future edition, or you left those instances aside? Thank you.
I left that issue aside simply because I was content that the text of the commentary reflected the positions of the experts and that there was no error there. And I construed my task as straight down the line as I possibly could. You see, it would have been all too easy to have started to embark on seeking to speculate as to what the positions of the experts were. I wasn't prepared to do that, and with respect, anyone commentating from the outside was also not in any position to say what the positions of the experts were. So therefore, that was well outside the scope of what I was being asked to do. You see, I was being asked to look at the literature and review whether the literature indicated that something needed to change. Well, the literature was never going to indicate that sort of amendment, so that was ultra vires.
Yeah, I'm
Sir.
Prashant from India. As a cyber lawyer, a cyber weapon has been defined. The changes have been suggested.
Sorry, could you start again?
The definition to the cyber weapon,
Yes.
the changes have been suggested. The changes to cyber weapon,
Yes.
the definition,
Yes, okay.
you have suggested certain things.
Yes.
Is cyber-enabled weapon also contemplated?
A cyber-enabled weapon? What
Like,
do you mean by that?
You have an aerial vehicle or you have a drones which has been either managed by software or
Yes.
destroyed by software, either
Yes.
of this case. Is that been contemplated in the definition?
No. There is a link, essential link, between the notion of cyber attack and the notion of a cyber weapon, it seems to me. Okay? So I am interpreting the cyber weapon as being the instrumentality for the undertaking of a cyber attack. And the main focus of my suggested amendment takes away any suggestion of capability, something being capable of doing something, and is much more concerned with its use to do something, its designed to do something, or it's intended to do something, because those are the three kinds of activity in relation to either an object, like a rock, or a piece of cyber software, if you like, or whatever, which would convert it into being a cyber weapon.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks again for Bill BOOTHBY. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thanks.